There were 300 bodies in that studio. But aback that articulation rang out. Not a distinct animation could be heard. The cameras were rolling, the lights were blazing, and Paul McCartney's fingers were dancing above the strings of his guitar. Aggregate was perfect. Aggregate was activity absolutely as planned. Until it wasn't. Jimmy Fallon stood at his desk, his signature smile arctic on his face. Paul McCartney, an active fable who had performed on stages about the Apple for over 6 decades, aback went still. His fingers chock-full moving. The music died. And in that moment, 300 bodies in flat 6 beheld their aggregate animation, as article amazing abundant afore their eyes. What happened in the abutting 3 account would become one of the best affecting moments in backward night television history. And it all started with articulation that no one accepted to hear. Subscribe and leave an animated version because the best able allotment of this adventure is still ahead. It was a Tuesday night taping of The Tonight Show. The activity in Flat 6B was electric as it consistently was aback a agreeable fable graced the stage. Paul McCartney, above Beatle, Bedrock and Cycle Anteroom of Famer, and one of the best acclaimed musicians in history, was appointed to perform Let It Be as allotment of the show's closing segment. Jimmy Fallon had been advancing for this moment all week. His producers had anxiously planned every detail, camera angles, lighting cues, the complete edition banter. McCartney had done the actualization before, and every actualization was ratings gold. The Admirers was arranged with admirers who had waited months for tickets. Some traveling from altered states aloof for adventitious to see the fable accomplish live. Backstage an hour afore showtime, Jimmy absolved through his accepted pre-show routine. He advised his agenda cards, ran through his address jokes with his writers, and arrested in with the roots. Aggregate was accepted procedure, but there was article his producers hadn't told him yet. Article they were befitting quiet until the complete aftermost moment. In the blooming room, a woman in her backward 70s sat agilely on a couch, clutching a beat-covering journal. Her name was Margaret, and she had been arrived as an appropriate bedfellow by one of the show's chief producers. The account she captivated independent article precious. Handwritten lyrics to Let It Be Bound in 1970 accustomed to her by her backward bedmate who had already formed as a complete architect at Abbey Road Studios. Margaret's bedmate Thomas had anesthetized abroad 6 months beforehand, afterwards a connected action with cancer. Afore he died, he fabricated her affiance one thing. Aback you apprehend let it be again, bethink that I'm still here. In every note, in every word I'll be there. Tonight, Margaret was in the admirers to account that promise. But what she didn't know, and what no one in the flat could accept predicted, was that her attendance would actualize a moment that would change everything. The actualization began like any added Tuesday night. Jimmy delivered his address with his brand energy. The admirers roaring with laughter. Celebrity guests came and went, the Roots performed. Aggregate confused like a well-oiled machine. Afresh came the moment anybody had been cat and mouse for. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy appeared with 18-karat excitement, assuming Let It Be, the one and alone Paul McCartney. The admirers erupted. McCartney absolved assimilate the date with that timeless grace, guitar in hand, and took his bench on a stool below a distinct spotlight. Jimmy stood off to the side, accoutrements crossed, animated like a kid on Christmas morning. This was what he lived for, these moments of authentic ability and magic. Paul began to play. His fingers confused above the strings with the beef anamnesis of a lifetime. The aperture chords of Let It Be abounding the studio, and the admirers affected in aggregate reverence. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was aggregate it should accept been. But a fresh article happened that no one in that flat, and no one watching at home could accept any time expected. 3 verses in, aloof as Paul accomplished the choir for the additional time, articulation from the admirers began to sing along. Not loudly, not performatively, but with a trembling, affecting artlessness that cut through the air like a blade. It was Margaret. She hadn't planned to sing. She had promised herself she would aloof listen, aloof be present, aloof account Thomas in silence. But aback that choir began, aback those words, Let It Be, echoed through the studio, article central her bankrupt open. The affliction she had been captivation in for 6 months caked out in the anatomy of song. Her articulation was fragile, wavering, but it agitated a weight that no able achievement anytime could. It was the complete of a woman canonizing her husband. The complete of adulation actual loss. Paul McCartney heard it. His fingers hesitated on the guitar. He looked up from his instrument, scanning the audience, aggravating to locate the antecedent of that voice. And aback he began her sitting in the third row, tears alive bottomward her face, singing with her eyes closed. He did article he had never done in 60 years of performing. He chock-full playing. The guitar went silent. The flat fell into a hush, so abstruse that the hum of the date lights seemed deafening. Jimmy Fallon's smile faded. His eyes darted from Paul to the audience, abashing a blaze above his face. The producers in the ascendancy allowance froze, borderline whether to cut to bartering or let the moment breathe. Paul Boring stood up from his stool. He didn't say a word. He aloof absolved to the bend of the stage, still captivation his guitar, and looked anon at Margaret. "Ma'am," he said softly, his Liverpool emphasis breaking the silence. "Would you appear up here, please?" The admirers gasped. Jimmy's eyes went wide. Margaret opened her eyes, aback acquainted that the music had stopped, that anybody was attractive at her. A assembly of better appeared at her side, a claim allegorical her against the stage. As she climbed the steps, clutching her account to her chest, Jimmy saw article on her face that he accustomed immediately. It wasn't stark-all. It wasn't excitement. It was grief. Raw, unfiltered, angelic grief. And in that moment, Jimmy Fallon fabricated an accommodation that would baffle every producer's expectation, every arrangement protocol, every anxiously timed segment. He absolved over to Margaret and took her hand. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked gently, his articulation almost oral over the flat microphones. "Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret," Jimmy repeated, his throat tightening. "Why are you actuality tonight?" She looked at him, afresh at Paul, afresh at the hundreds of faces staring at her from the black above the lights. Her easily trembled as she opened the covering journal. "My husband," she began, her articulation shaking. "Thomas. He formed at Abbey Road in 1970. He was there aback. Paul recorded this song. He brought me home these lyrics handwritten as a gift. He said it was the best admirable affair he'd any time heard." Paul McCartney's announcement softened. He stepped closer. "Thomas anesthetized abroad 6 months ago." Margaret continued, tears spilling advisedly now. "Afore he died, he fabricated me affiance that aback I heard this song again, I would bethink that he's still here, that adulation doesn't end, that it aloof lets it be." The flat was silent, not the awkward blackout of aberration or abstruse difficulty. This was the blackout of 300 bodies captivation amplitude for article sacred. Jimmy accomplished up and alone his tie, affairs it off completely. It was in benumbed gesture. Article he did aback the achievement was over, aback the affectation could appear down. But in this moment, it meant article more. It meant he was no best the host. He was aloof a animal actuality witnessing article profound. Paul set his guitar bottomward acclaim, and took Margaret's easily in his. Thomas had acceptable taste, he said with a balmy smile. And he was right. Adulation doesn't end. It transforms. It becomes memory. It becomes song. He angry to Jimmy. "May I see the journal?" Margaret handed it to him with abashed hands. Paul opened it anxiously, and there in achromatic ink were the lyrics to Let It Be in his own autography from over 50 years ago. He stared at it for a connected moment, his eyes glistening. "I bethink this," Paul said quietly. "I bethink autograph these words. I bethink activity like they were meant for someone. Maybe they were meant for you, Margaret. Maybe they were meant for Thomas." He bankrupted the account and handed it aback to her. Afresh, he best up his guitar again. "Would you sing with me?" Paul asked. Margaret nodded, clumsy to speak. Paul began to bawl again. This time softer, slower, added intimate. And aback the choir came, Margaret sang. Her articulation was still shaky, still fragile. But now it was a budding by Paul McCartney's and afresh by Jimmy Fallon, and afresh by the absolute admirers' ascent to their feet. The roots a budding in from the ancillary stage. The cameras captured every tear, every abashed lip, every Duke apprentice to a heart. It was no best a performance. It was an aggregate act of remembering, of honoring, of absolution go. Aback the song ended, there was no applause, aloof silence. And afresh boring the admirers began to clap. Not the wild, raucous acclaim of an abundant performance, but the gentle, Abbey acclaim of assemblage to article holy. Jimmy absolved over to Margaret and accepted her. He didn't affliction that the cameras were rolling. He didn't affliction that they were way over their allotted time. He didn't affliction about annihilation except this woman and her affliction and the adorableness of what had aloof happened. Paul handed Margaret his guitar, aces for Thomas, he said. She took it, clutching it like a treasure, and whispered, "Thank you. Share and subscribe. Make abiding this adventure is never forgotten." Afterwards the admirers had filed out and the lights had dimmed. Jimmy sat in his bathrobe room, still cutting his clothing jacket, but no tie. His abeto agape on the door. "You okay, boss?" Jimmy nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm okay. I bear a minute." He anticipation about Margaret, about Thomas, about the ability of a song to backpack adulation above the abuttals amid activity and death. He anticipation about all the nights he'd hosted, all the celebrities he'd interviewed, all the viral moments and trending hashtags, and he accomplished that none of it mattered as abundant as what had happened tonight. The abutting morning, clips of the moment abounding amusing media. Bodies aggregate it with captions like, "I can't stop errant, and this is why music matters." And Jimmy Fallon is a chic act. But for Jimmy, it wasn't about the angle or the praise. It was about Margaret and Thomas and the admonition that below all the lights and cameras and scripted banter, there was article real, article human, article account endlessly aggregate for. From that night on, Jimmy kept an agenda in his board drawer. On it, he had accounting a distinct sentence. The actualization can wait, the being can't. And whenever he acquainted the burden of ratings or arrangement expectations or the adamant clip of nightly television, he would cull out that agenda and bethink the night Paul McCartney chock-full playing. The night 300 bodies captivated their breath. The night a woman sang for her bedmate and the accomplished Apple listened. But the adventure didn't end there. 3 weeks afterwards that taping, Jimmy accustomed a letter. It was from Margaret. Central the envelope was a photograph. Thomas and Margaret on their Belle's Day in 1968, both adolescent and radiant, continuing al fresco a baby Abbey in Liverpool. On the back, Margaret had written, "He would accept admired what you did. Thank you for absolution me say goodbye." Jimmy affianced that photograph to the corkboard in his appointment appropriate abutting to his Emmy Awards and affected photos with presidents and celebrities, because to him that photograph represented article added admired than any accolade. It represented the moment he remembered why he got into this business in the Aboriginal place. Not for the laughs, not for the ratings, but for the connection, the animal affiliation that transcends screens and cameras and scripted jokes. Paul McCartney never forgot that night either. In interviews afterwards, Aback asked about his best memorable performances, he would consistently acknowledge the night in Flat 6B Aback a woman sang for her husband. He would allocution about how in all his years of performing, he had never acquainted the ability of music absolutely like he did in that moment. How it reminded him that songs aren't aloof entertainment. They're argosy for memory, for love, for the things we can't say out loud. The guitar aces he gave Margaret became an ancestor's heirloom. Aback Margaret anesthetized abroad 2 years later, affably in her sleep. Her babe begin at tucked central that covering account abutting to the handwritten lyrics. At Margaret's funeral they played, "Let It Be." And as the song abounding the baby chapel, her babe swore she could apprehend 2 choirs singing in harmony. Her mother's and her father's assuredly reunited. The Tonight actualization never aired that articulation in its Aboriginal form. The arrangement accounted it too affecting for backward night television, afraid it would agitate the pacing, the comedy, the blueprint that had formed for decades. But Jimmy fought them. He fought adamantine, and eventually they compromised. They aired a below adaptation with abnegation at the Alpha Answer the Context. That below adaptation garnered over 50 actor angle online, oral the Aboriginal Week. Bodies from every bend of the apple watched it, aggregate it, cried over it. Comments caked in by the thousands. Stories of loss, of love, of moments aback a song had adored someone's activity or helped them say goodbye. The video became an agenda memorial, a abode area strangers aggregate to account their own grief, their own memories, their own versions of Thomas and Margaret. Because sometimes the best able moments aren't planned. They're surrendered to. They're honored. They're let be. And aback they ripple apparent in means we can never predict. Touching lives we'll never meet. Healing wounds we'll never see. That's the bequest of that Tuesday night. That's the bequest of our articulation in the darkness. A guitar that chock-full playing. And a host who remembered that below all the allure and spectacle, we're all aloof animal beings aggravating to authority onto the bodies we love, alike afterwards they're gone.